3.3 Alex Lees. Stress. Throughout scenario 1, Nick appears to show many symptoms of severe stress. Stress is defined as a pattern of negative physiological states of psychological responses occurring in situations where people perceive threats to their well-being, which they may be unable to meet. Lazarus and Folleman, 1984. There are many different symptoms of stress within different elements. There are three major ones. These are somatic, cognitive, and behavioral anxiety. Somatic stress is what happens to you physically via the ANS, or the autonomic nervous system. There are many systems that are increased. These are heart rate, breathing rate, heat production, and adrenaline. These are only some of the symptoms that occur. Cognitive anxiety is anxious thoughts, fearful anticipation, poor concentration, difficult with memory. All of these cognitive symptoms link well with Nick. And behavioral anxiety is feelings of tension, irritability, restlessness, worries, inability to relax, and depression. We then have the stress process. There are many ways that the first stage, demand, can be viewed. Demand could be positive or negative, or in a sporting context, a challenge or a threat. The positive challenge, if you view it that way, will lead to eustress, which is meaning beneficial stress. It can be either psychological or physical. Eustress refers to the positive response one has to a stressor, which can depend on a person's current feelings of control, desirability, location, and the timing of the stressor. Then it can be also seen as a threat, which is in the graph above would be distress. Distress is the increased worry of your surrounding. This then means that your performance level will decrease since you are not performing very well. Throughout scenario 1, Nick shows many signs of stress, like when he struggles to play the more precise and accurate shot. This stress is very high, which means Nick would fall into the distress category, or in the distress zone in the graph above. The graph above shows the level of stress in three different sectors: calm, eustress, and distress. You can see that Nick would probably have started off in the eustress category, but has slowly moved into the distress zone. The fact that Nick is constantly worrying about his grade also shows that he has some cognitive anxiety as well, which could possibly lead to his distress in games and other causes of stress. There are many causes to stress, but I feel like Nick's stress, the majority of Nick's stress, comes from external factors, like him being stressed by the amount of people in the crowd. But the internal factors to stress also play a huge role in Nick's stress, as he is constantly worrying about his grades. Anxiety. Anxiety is defined as a negative state or worry, apprehension, or tension that often occurs in the absence of real or obvious danger. Typically, the tension felt by anxious individuals is accompanied by a heightened state of physiological arousal. Buckwork and Dishman, 2002. Anxiety is a negative reaction from the performance to stress, which often leads to over-arousal. There are many different types of anxiety, but the two main types of anxiety are trait and state anxiety. State anxiety is caused in a specific moment in time. It is also an ever-changing mood. There are two different types of state anxiety: cognitive state anxiety and somatic state anxiety. Cognitive state anxiety is the thought component of anxiety. Somatic relates to your perception of the physiological changes that happen in a particular situation. This is what Nick is possibly going through, since some of the symptoms of this are muscle tension, sweating, and increased body heat. This is what choking is, and this is him missing the precise and accurate shots. It is the environment that gives you the somatic anxiety. Trait anxiety is how anxious you really are as a person. It is a behavioural tendency to feel threatened, even in situations that are not really threatening. We then have competitive anxiety. Competitive anxiety is how the performer perceives the sporting situation they're in. Competitive anxiety can be defined as competitive state anxiety usually follows patterns of subjective feelings of tension and inadequacy combined with the heightened arousal of the ANS, also known as the autonomic nervous system. Hackthornton, Schweinknesger, 1989. I probably butchered that. Both elite and beginner performers experience high levels of anxiety before and during a performance. There are many factors that affect competitive anxiety. This could be before or during a competition. So, before a competition, you'll think about all the bad things that might go on, like failing an important game-changing moment, such as a penalty in football, or in Nick's case, failing the precise and accurate shots. Another one could be the fear of injury. These would usually be the same during the competition or performance. Within anxiety, you have facilitative and deliberate. It begins with the stressor, and we will determine whether or not we have control over it or not. If we do, then we have the ability to cope with it. We will also determine whether we can or can't control it, and if we can't control it, then we do not have the ability to cope or the ability for goal attainment. These would be the symptoms for deliberate. There are also many ways of measuring anxiety. One good way of measuring anxiety would be a questionnaire, as it is a very good way of getting an idea of someone's anxiety levels. So throughout scenario 1, Nick shows to experience high levels of trait anxiety. This is shown in scenario 1 when it says he is constantly worrying about his grades. The anxiety Nick experiences is somatic, as he feels nauseous before a game, which is a physical symptom, therefore determining it to be somatic. However, somatic anxiety is anxiety caused/triggered by cognitive anxiety, meaning Nick has both cognitive and somatic forms of anxiety. Arousal. Arousal is a general physiological and psychological activation varying on the continuum from deep sleep to intense excitement. Weinberg and Gould, 2007. The RAS is a bundle of nerves at the brainstem which regulates our levels of arousal and monitors level of stimulation. So, the amount of stimulation of these nerves is what determines the level of arousal we have. Introverts and extroverts would seek for different levels of stimulation of this. Introverts would obviously have less, whereas extroverts would have a lot more. There are many sports which require different levels of arousal to perform successfully. Many sports like football, rugby, and hockey would mean that you have higher arousal levels, whereas archery and gymnastics would have low levels of arousal, since the concentration levels are a lot lower, or sorry, a lot higher, lower. Different arousal levels for different sports as well. Nick in scenario 1. Nick is a college basketball player, which means that he has a lot of for his arousal he needs to be moderate levels. So it's not extremely high, but not extremely low. Like football, you have to have precise shots, so the more optimum your arousal levels are, the better you will perform. You can see in the graph above on your screen right now an example of an arousal graph. The optimum one where Nick would want to be would be in the middle, which is the most optimum because it's not too high but it's not too low. This would differ for an archery person since their optimum arousal level will be a lot lower on the left hand side. It would have shifted over to the left, so they're not as hyperactive as a basketball player or a football player. Whereas for a weightlifter, uh, their optimum arousal level will be shifted to the right since they are obviously a weightlifter, so they need to be more aroused to lift a very large amount of weight. There are two different types of arousal. You have somatic and cognitive. Somatic is the physiological part of it, and cognitive is the mental part of it. I've split up arousal into many different more PowerPoints. So, drive theory. The drive theory was created by Hull in 1951, and it suggested that there is a linear relationship between arousal and performance. As you can see in the graph above, increased levels of arousal lead to an increased performance. For Nick, I would say that this isn't a very good explanation because when he is highly aroused, his performance level decreases and he is much less successful, which is the opposite to what the drive theory suggests. This is a prime example of some of the criticisms that the drive theory pulled in. People said that the drive theory was bad because it assumes things like low arousal means poor performance, when people like Nick will perform better when less aroused. The inverted U theory. The inverted U theory was created by Robert Yerkes and John Dodson in 1908. This theory suggests that there is a curvilinear relationship between arousal and performance. As you can see in the graph above, as arousal increases, so does performance, but to an optimal point where then further increases in arousal, it can cause performance to gradually decline. This is better explanation for Nick, but it is still not very good. This is because he will have an optimum level of arousal, which will lead to him to perform better. However, Nick is often over-aroused and therefore can't perform at his best. This is also a good example of the criticisms that this theory has gotten. People have argued that the optimum level of arousal isn't always at the midpoint of the curve. Like I said earlier, it could be shifted to the left depending on the sport, or shifted to the right depending on the sport. I would also say this is very true for Nick, as he is a very anxious person, which means his optimum arousal level will probably be lower than the average person, therefore not being at the midpoint in the curve. Catastrophe theory. The catastrophe theory was created by Fazey and Hardy in 1988. As you can see in the two figures above, this theory suggests that someone's performance does not always gradually deteriorate as arousal increases, which is what the inverted U theory suggested. What this theory suggested is that both cognitive and somatic anxieties are high. An athlete will follow the inverted U theory to an extent, but if something drastic was to go wrong in their performance, then there would be a dramatic decline in performance, and not just a gradual one. This athlete one messes up and could lead to their performance being off for the rest of the game. This theory perfectly explains Nick's situation, as the scenario states that he struggles to play more precise, accurate shots, and if he makes an error, his performance falls apart. This suggestion is over-aroused he may be. For example, if he misses an important shot, this will one mistake. Oh, I'm out of time.